Okay, so picture this. You're looking out your window and you see a small fire on a nearby hillside. Almost pretty, you know?
Yeah.
But then within minutes, it just explodes. It becomes this raging inferno. And it's all fueled by like hurricane force winds.
Wow.
This isn't hypothetical. This was the reality for
Yeah.
people in Altadena back in January 2025 when the Eaton fire ripped through their community.
Yeah, and what makes the Eaton fire so significant is that, Altadena is a community that knows wildfires.
Right.
They're familiar with them. But this was something else. This was unprecedented.
Yeah.
In just 12 hours, this fire destroyed 7,000 structures, and it tragically took at least 14 lives.
You brought a bunch of articles
Yeah.
that detail the timeline of the Eaton fire.
Right.
And that's what we're going to deep dive into today. We're going to try to understand how this seemingly small fire became so devastating. And we're going to explore some of the decisions that were made during those just crazy, chaotic hours.
Yeah, I think breaking it down hour by hour
Yeah.
will really help us to understand how this unfolded.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things I noticed in these articles is an eyewitness account from Michael Olson.
Okay.
And he initially thought that he could actually put the fire out himself.
Oh, wow.
But then within minutes, he's witnessing what he describes as, quote, a mountain of flame.
Yeah.
It's shocking how quickly this escalated.
And that really speaks to how fast these fires can grow,
Yeah.
especially when they're driven by, really strong winds.
Right.
The articles mentioned that the firefighters were on the scene really quickly.
Yeah.
But the winds, 59 miles an hour with gusts up to 80,
Oh, my
it
God.
made it almost impossible to contain the fire.
Yeah. And it wasn't even just the wind itself. The articles talk about something called an ember storm.
Right.
What exactly is an ember storm?
So an ember storm is kind of like, it's a firestorm that creates its own weather system, basically.
Oh, wow.
The heat generates these powerful updrafts.
Okay.
And these updrafts carry burning embers, sometimes as big as your fist, for miles.
Miles. Wow.
Yeah, these embers rain down, and they ignite these spot fires far ahead of the main fire front.
So instead of fighting like one fire,
Right.
they're suddenly dealing with
Multiple fires.
multiple fires popping up, like
Sure.
unpredictably.
Yeah, and you can hear that in the the chaos that comes through in those radio transmissions.
You're right.
They're constantly reacting.
Yeah.
Instead of being able to plan ahead. And it made it really difficult to predict where this fire was going to spread next.
Yeah. And in one of the articles, Pasadena Fire Chief Chad Augustin is quoted as saying, quote, "I'm going to lose half of my town."
Wow.
It really underscores the gravity of the situation.
It does. And it really highlights how this fire was different.
Yeah.
It challenged like all the conventional wisdom about wildfires. They were forced to like adapt on the fly.
Right.
Make these really tough decisions.
Yeah.
With very limited resources.
Right.
And the threat was constantly shifting.
So as the fire raged on, firefighters faced what seemed like an impossible task.
Yeah.
What other challenges did they encounter in those first few hours?
Well, for one, they couldn't even rely on air support.
Really?
Yeah, the winds were so high that it grounded the aircraft.
Wow.
So they didn't have that vital tool. Imagine trying to fight a fire, a blaze of that magnitude, from the ground only,
Yeah.
with limited visibility
Yeah.
because of all the smoke and the embers raining down.
Oh, man. And there's an article about this 17-year-old, Carter Johns. And he actually ran through his neighborhood warning people about the fire.
Wow.
And it really emphasizes just how fast
Yeah.
this thing was spreading.
And what's so interesting about that detail is that, it speaks to the chaos,
Right.
how quickly this unfolded. People were just going about their evening completely unaware of this danger that was approaching.
At what point did they realize that this fire was different, that the usual tactics weren't going to work?
I think, as we move into hour 2, we see a real turning point. The firefighters have to make this really difficult decision.
Yeah.
They had to shift from, protecting structures to prioritizing evacuations, saving lives.
Oh, wow.
They simply couldn't contain the fire anymore.
So in just the first 2 hours,
Right.
the Eaton fire had gone from
It transformed, yeah.
a manageable brush fire
Yeah.
to this unstoppable force.
Yeah, and those relentless winds and that constant barrage of embers, they kept igniting new fires. And over the next few hours, we're going to see this fire continue its destructive march westward.
Yeah. And the accounts from hours 6 through 8 really reveal how strained resources were becoming.
Absolutely.
Let's delve into that a bit.
Yeah, I think, the radio transmissions from that period, uh, they really show how things were getting more and more difficult.
Okay.
Units were running low on fuel. Personnel were spread thin
Wow.
across this, ever-widening fire front. It was like they were trying to, hold back a tidal wave with a handful of sandbags.
Yeah.
The scale of it was just overwhelming.
And then came that really difficult decision to evacuate all residents north of the 210 freeway.
That's right.
Hmm?
And that was a decision that, it likely saved countless lives.
Right.
But it also meant abandoning entire communities to the flames. It was a difficult choice.
Yeah.
But in a disaster like this, sometimes the best course of action is just to save as many lives as you can.
So as we approach the 8th hour, the fire was still out of control.
Right.
Resources were depleted.
Yeah.
Entire neighborhoods were being evacuated. What happened next?
Well, let's find out.
Okay.
So as we get into hours 11 and 12, the articles start to shift a bit. They move away from the firefight itself and start to focus more on the human cost, the real tragedy of the Eaton fire.
Yeah. Yeah, you really start to see that through the personal stories, like the one about Early and Louise Kelly,
Right.
the 83-year-old woman who texted her granddaughter saying she was going to take a picture of the fire. That one really got to me.
It's heartbreaking. And
Huh.
it really highlights just how quickly everything happened.
Yeah.
How people were caught completely off guard. It's easy to underestimate these wind-driven fires, how fast and how fierce they can be.
And the story about the Shaw siblings, Shuri and Victor.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Shuri, she tried so desperately to convince her brother, who had some health issues, to evacuate.
Right.
But he refused. And it's just tragic. It makes you think about how tough it must be to make rational decisions when you're facing that kind of fear and uncertainty.
Absolutely. And then there's the account of the Mitchells, Anthony Sr. and Justin. It really underscores how vulnerable people with disabilities are during these kinds of chaotic events.
Yeah.
They were relying on help to get out, and it just never came in time.
Reading these stories, it's clear that the impact of this fire, it goes way beyond just the number of structures that were lost.
Oh, for sure.
It's about the lives that were lost, the families that were torn apart, the trauma that rippled through the community.
And while all of this is happening, amidst these personal tragedies, we get these radio transmissions from the first responders.
Yeah.
And they paint such a vivid picture of the chaos and desperation. I mean, they were overwhelmed. Reports of people trapped, multiple houses on fire at the same time.
Right.
Resources stretched to the breaking point.
There's one transmission that really stood out to me. It was a request to order an excavator to tear apart some buildings that are partially down, because they were throwing off a pretty serious ember cast. What does that even mean?
It's a fascinating transmission because it shows how the fire itself was creating new dangers. Embercast refers to the shower of burning embers coming from these collapsing structures.
Oh, okay.
So by demolishing those buildings, they were trying to eliminate those sources of ignition.
Right.
Prevent the fire from spreading further. I mean, it was a desperate measure.
Yeah.
But it highlights the extreme conditions they were dealing with.
It sounds like they were constantly trying to stay one step ahead, but the fire was always a step ahead of them.
That's a great way to put it. And it brings up this point about urban fuel. The articles mention that the fire eventually slowed down as it reached the limits of that urban fuel. Basically, the fire was running out of things to burn within the city itself.
So in a way, the fire's own destructive power is what eventually helped to slow it down?
Yeah, in a way. But, we can't forget that this slowdown came at a tremendous cost. Thousands of homes destroyed, lives lost.
Right, right. It sounds like even as it started to wane, it was still claiming victims. Were there any signs in the transmissions that things were finally coming under control?
Yeah, the transmissions from that 12th hour, they're interesting. You can hear a shift in the tone. There's still this sense of urgency.
Yeah.
But there's also a glimmer of hope. The fire's intensity is decreasing, the winds are dying down. But you can also hear the emotional toll it's taken on the firefighters. I mean, they've witnessed so much destruction, so much loss.
It's a reminder that even when the flames are out, the scars run deep. What was the immediate aftermath like, and what were the long-term implications of this fire?
The aftermath was devastating. Thousands of people displaced, the community grappling with this unimaginable loss. The fire really raised some serious questions.
Like what?
about wildfire preparedness, about urban planning,
Okay.
and about the role of climate change in these increasingly destructive events.
The Eaton fire wasn't just a local tragedy.
Yeah,
It was a wake-up call for
sure.
communities everywhere.
It forced us to confront the reality that these disasters are becoming more common, more intense. It highlighted the need to adapt our strategies for preventing them and for responding to them.
So, as we move beyond the timeline of the fire itself, what are some of the key lessons that we can learn from this event? What really stands out to you from these articles?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that wildfires are no longer just a rural problem.
Right.
As we saw with the Eaton fire, urban areas are increasingly vulnerable, especially with climate change fueling these extreme weather events.
Yeah, this fire showed us that they can erupt and spread incredibly fast, even in densely populated areas.
Exactly. And we can't just rely on traditional firefighting methods to combat them.
So what do we do? What needs to change?
I think we need a multifaceted approach, something that combines firefighting efforts with proactive measures to reduce risk and make communities more resilient.
Okay, so what does that look like?
It means things like creating defensible space around homes, implementing stricter building codes, investing in early warning systems.
What about the role of technology? Could technology have played a bigger role in preventing or mitigating the damage?
Absolutely. We're seeing some really exciting advancements in wildfire technology.
Like what?
Well, like using AI and drones for fire detection and monitoring.
Yeah.
There's also the potential of using real-time data analysis and modeling to help predict fire behavior, inform evacuation strategies. These technologies could be game changers.
It sounds like we need to be investing in them now, not waiting for the next disaster.
Exactly. And we also need to learn from the experiences of those firefighters who are on the front lines. Their firsthand accounts can provide such valuable insights
Right.
into what worked, what didn't, and where we need to improve.
You mentioned community resilience earlier. What does that actually look like in practice? How can communities become more resilient in the face of wildfire threats?
Well, community resilience involves several key things. It starts with education and awareness.
Okay.
Residents need to understand the risks, the steps they can take to protect themselves and their property.
So it's not just about firefighting. It's about creating a culture of preparedness.
Exactly. It's about empowering individuals, getting them to take ownership of their safety, and working together to build more fire-adapted communities. Things like neighborhood watch programs, community cleanup days to reduce fuel loads,
Right.
making sure everyone has an evacuation plan. These things all make a difference.
The Eaton fire really serves as this stark reminder that wildfire preparedness isn't just for folks in rural areas.
No, not anymore.
It's an issue that affects all of us.
Yeah.
And we need to be proactive.
We do. We have to be.
Absolutely. The Eaton fire was a tragedy, but it also presents an opportunity. An opportunity to learn, to adapt, and to build more resilient communities.
We need to take those lessons to heart and act on them before the next firestorm ignites.
You know, going through all of this, it feels like we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
From that initial spark
Right.
to the devastation, the aftermath,
Absolutely.
and then even looking at the long-term implications of the Eaton fire.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. And through it all, one thing that really sticks out to me is how this fire challenged how we think about wildfires, you know, those conventional ideas.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Like in what way?
Well, we tend to think of wildfires as something that happens out in the wilderness, in those remote areas.
Right. Like in forests.
Exactly. But the Eaton fire, it tore through a community, a suburban community.
Yeah.
It showed us that wildfires aren't just a rural problem anymore.
Right.
They're a threat to cities, towns, all those urban areas.
And that's a pretty scary thought, especially as more and more people are moving into those areas that border wildland.
It's a growing concern, for sure. And it really highlights the need for a different approach, a more holistic way of managing wildfires.
Okay. So we can't just rely on, like, traditional firefighting.
Right.
We have to be thinking about prevention, how to prepare communities,
Right.
and building those fire-resilient communities you talked about.
Exactly. And when we talk about fire-resilient communities, it means a lot of things.
Like what does that actually look like?
Well, it starts with, smarter land use planning.
Yeah.
We need to be careful about where we allow development, especially in those high-risk areas.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then making sure that new construction uses fire-resistant materials.
Okay.
And incorporates design features that can help protect those structures.
So thinking about building codes, zoning regulations, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And then creating defensible space around homes.
Right, I've heard about that. That's where you clear the vegetation around your house.
Exactly. Clear out a certain radius around the structures, keep trees trimmed, use fire-resistant landscaping. Those things can make a big difference.
And those are all things that, like, homeowners can do themselves, right?
Yeah, for sure. Individual actions are really important, but it also takes a community-wide effort.
Okay.
We need to work together, reduce fuel loads, come up with evacuation plans,
Right.
and educate people about fire safety. It really does take a village.
It does. It does. And this whole deep dive has really highlighted the importance of being proactive.
Yeah.
You know, not just waiting until a fire starts, but
Right.
taking steps now
Right.
to prepare and to reduce those risks.
I think that's key. We need to shift our thinking, move away from just fighting fires, and focus more on preventing them in the first place. And that means changing how we view our relationship with nature, with the environment.
Yeah. And speaking of our relationship with nature, you know, the Eaton fire, it brings up these questions about climate change
Oh, definitely.
and how it's impacting wildfire behavior.
Climate change is a huge factor. Warmer temperatures, drier conditions,
Right.
more extreme weather events. It's all creating this perfect storm for wildfires.
So it's not just about, like, you know, where we build
Right.
or how we manage the vegetation.
It's bigger than that.
It's about addressing those root causes.
Exactly. Wildfire mitigation has to be part of a much larger strategy for adapting to climate change.
Right.
Reducing emissions, investing in renewable energy, promoting sustainable land management.
It's a lot.
It is.
As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I have to say I'm feeling a lot of things.
I get it.
Sadness for those who are lost, admiration for the first responders,
Absolutely.
and just this sense of urgency, like we need to act.
Yeah. I share those feelings. The Eaton fire was a terrible tragedy, but it also taught us a lot about being prepared, being resilient,
Yeah.
and remembering that we're all connected to the natural world.
This deep dive has really given us a lot to think about, hasn't it? The challenges those firefighters face, the
Yeah.
human cost,
For
the
sure.
role of technology, and
Yeah.
then those bigger questions about climate change
Yeah.
and our responsibility to protect our communities and the environment.
In the end, it really comes down to a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Do we wait for the next disaster? Or do we take action now to create a better future, a safer future?
The choice is ours. Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to think about the lessons of the Eaton fire
Yeah.
and how each of us can contribute to creating a world that's ready for the challenges ahead.
A fire-adapted world.